Okay, so what's up, guys? Today I'm going to talk about what is Mars aspects. What are the aspects that Mars give off, and what is it doing? You know. So first of all, let's start off briefly by explaining what are some of the natural significations, the natural karakas of Mars. There's a bunch of karakas associated with all the planets and all the houses, and it'd be damn near impossible to list them all in one video. But in general, Mars represents brothers, male friends, how courageous and brave you are. It represents weapons. Mars is also a significator of land. You see, Mars is a significator of land, and Moon is a significator of a home. They might be thinking, what the hell is the difference? Well, Mars, it naturally has like the significations of like a soldier. That's what KRS astrology likes to say. But it's pretty much true. Mars has the significations of a soldier. It is associated with weapons and aggression and assertion. And and it wants to conquer things. It wants to impose its will on other things. It inflicts damage and pain on other things. But I gotta be careful saying that, because I gotta give y'all more context for things that I say, because it might not make sense for why I'm saying certain things. But stereotypically, a soldier, you go to a land, you go to a country, you kick in doors, you kill the children, unfortunately, and do all the types of inhumane stuff, and you take over a land, you take over a country. So Mars is naturally associated with land. And there's also a mythological story for why Mars is associated with land. But I forget the details off the top of my head. I believe one of the other names for Mars is known as Bhumi, Bhumi, or Bhoomi, which I believe is a word or phrase that means land. But long story short, Mars is a natural significator of land. So that could just be, being like Bill Gates, who is buying a whole bunch of land right now. Or it could be like some big time business person who is buying some land and doing some construction and building something. Naturally, houses and properties go on land, but Mars just represents land. And Moon represents a home, because it's a bit of a difference. You could buy, Mars could just represent land, and it could just be like a business going on top of that land. Or it could just be like a strip club going on top of that land. It's just land. It don't matter what you put on the land, but what you put on that land probably doesn't feel necessarily like a home. Somewhere that you feel safe, that you can unwind and be yourself. Moon is more so of a significator of a home where you can raise a family, be yourself, have a nice little safe community. So Moon is more so a significator of a home, and Mars is more so a significator of just a land in general, and just damn near anything can go on top of the damn land. So, anyway, like I said, Mars is male friends, guns, lands, weapons, assertion, anger, courageousness, bravery. Yeah, that's essentially it. Those are the natural significations of Mars. There might be other finer, detailed things associated with Mars, but they escape me, and I haven't really heard too much difference. So, those are significations of Mars. And Mars originally rules the first... It rules Aries and rules Scorpio. And Aries and Scorpio is associated with the first and the 8th house. And with Mars having association with Aries and the first house represents you, yourself, your physical body, and the forehead area. So think about it. The first house represents from here, basically from the eyebrows and above, the forehead, this area, which contains your brain. So that's another thing that Mars is associated with. It's associated with like logic or practical intelligence, because the house that Mars originally is associated with and the sign that it originally rules is associated with this area, the forehead. So Mars can be sort of associated with like logical, practical intelligence, and with it being the ruler of the first sign Aries in the first house in the physical body, we see that, you know, Mars is concerned about putting itself first, dealing with itself, making sure that it is good. So Mars can be sort of selfish. And then Scorpio is associated with the 8th house, and the 8th house is associated with surgeries and incidents and accidents and uncovering secrets, digging up stuff. To dig up stuff, to perform surgery, you gotta pierce something. You have to pierce things. So this is why when Mars aspects a planet or a house or is conjunct a planet, it pierces that planet. It inflicts damage to some extent on that planet, on that house, you know, because Mars originally rules 1st and 8th, Aries and Scorpio. So it's going to have some of the natural, with it being the owner of those two signs, it's going to naturally have some of those natural traits, some of those natural significances of it. So, yeah, I'm trying to make sure there's anything else I'm missing in regards to Mars before I move on. So, anyway, let's get to it. Let's start off with the 7th aspect that Mars gives off. So, for the sake of this example, I'm going to just say that Mars is in the 11th house. And Mars, with his 7th aspect, is going to be looking at the 5th house. Now, what is the 11th house? The 11th house is large social network circles, organizations, and gains. Eldest sibling. And the 5th house is dating, romance, children, hobbies, politics, learning, and those type of things. And you got Mars sitting in the 11th house, but it's giving its 7th aspect to the 5th house. So the 7th aspect is going to have some of the natural significations of what is associated with the 7th house, which is relationships. And if you watch my intro to aspects video, 7th house is also associated with business and entrepreneurship. So with the 7th aspect that Mars gives, or with any planet gives, it's sort of flirting with the house opposite of it. And for me to make this even clearer, I like to humanize the planets and give all these great elaborate, you know, analogies. So check this out. Imagine the 7th aspect that a planet gives is like a date. So Mars is in the 11th house in the sign of Cancer, which means that the ascendant is Virgo. So Mars is in Cancer in the 11th house, and it wants to go and speak to the 5th house. It wants to go to the 5th house. With its 7th aspect, it wants to go on the 5th house. It's essentially leaving the 11th house to go on a date to the 5th house. So what Mars is going to do is, he knows that he rules 2 houses, because Mars rules 2 signs. Mars rules Aries, Mars rules Scorpio. So you got to look at what 2 houses that Mars is ruling in the house that it sits in, based upon the ascendant. So for the sake of a Virgo ascendant, Mars rules the 3rd house, which is Scorpio, and it rules the 8th house, which is Aries. And it wants to go on a date with the 5th house, which is Capricorn. He wants to go on a date with this Capricorn woman. So, you know, he don't got time to go to his 2 houses. He don't got time to go to the 3rd house and 8th house and bring the things of those houses and show it to her. But you know what he's going to do? He's going to go in the 11th house. He's going to put on some nice clothes. He's going to get his car or whatever. And he's going to pull the resources that he has from his 11th house and bring it with him to his date to the 5th house. But Yeah, so he basically bringing things from his house that he's directly in on a date with the woman. But don't think that just because he only brought things from the 11th house, that he only brought things from this date to the 5th house, that his other two, that him owning 2 other houses is not going to have no influence. Don't think that. No. So when Mars is on that date with the 5th house in Capricorn, you know, he's going to be eating or whatever, and he's going to tell her that, hey, you know, also, by the way, do you know I own 2 houses? I own the 3rd house and I own the 8th house. And the woman might be like, ooh, you own 2 houses? And she might be impressed. She might be impressed by, ooh, I like him. He got his stuff together. Or she might be like, oh, well, he got 2 houses and 2 lands, then I can just keep my money in my pocket. He can just spend all his money on me. Or she might be like, oh, he telling me he got 2 houses on the first date or whatever. I feel as though that he's bragging and stuff, you know. I don't really like that. So what I'm essentially saying is that with Mars 7th aspect, he's going to bring the influences of the 11th house to the 5th house, and the other 2 houses that Mars rule will also influence the 5th house. So hopefully that crazy example didn't confuse y'all, but I'm gonna go over it a little bit again, but without so much of a, you know, funny little illustration. So long story short, with Mars being in the 11th house, he's going to bring the 11th house things that I keep repeating. A Mars in the 11th house individual could want to use their influence of their large social network circle. They could want to use the influence of that social network circle. They could want to use maybe their influence or assistance of their elder sibling, or just, yeah, they would just use their network circle and elder sibling to help them do the 5th house things, which is hobbies, politics, children, romance, dating. Some way, somehow, Mars is going to use the eldest sibling or its network circle or its large financial gains and pool in order to do 5th house things. He's going to maybe from the 11th house try to use revenue to fund its creative hobbies and talents. It might want to use his large revenue and network circle to maybe go on a bunch of dates. It might use his large network circle and revenue to nurture and raise the children. That's what Mars would want to do, with it being in the 11th house, given its 7th aspect. And with Mars being in the, well, it don't matter what house is in general, but I'm just using this house as an example. With Mars 7th aspect in general, Mars is going to pierce and damage whatever house it aspects, whatever planet it aspects. It's going to do some damage. And depending on nakshatras and signs and what house it rules, we'll see if it damages first and then it might produce good results, or if it's just a completely negative, malefic planet with malefic rulership. So, but in general, with Mars 7th aspect, he'll pierce, and then Mars will be, to some degree, depending on all those other things that I just told you, will try to dominate with the 7th aspect. It'll try to dominate, rule, and control with the 7th aspect. Like, for example, if you got Mars within the 1st house, then with its 7th aspect, it might try to naturally dominate and control the partner. You could try to dominate naturally. You could try to naturally dominate and control the people that you date. And if Mars is in the 7th house, then we can see that the people that you date and attract, they could try to dominate and control you. But that's Mars 7th aspect. So let's talk about Mars 4th aspect. Mars 4th aspect is going to have the significations of the 4th house. So let's say that, for the sake of this example, let's say that Mars is still in the 11th house in Cancer, debilitated. Mars 4th aspect will go onto the 2nd house of your speech, your finances, and the family that you come from. So the 4th aspect of Mars could make you very protective, and it can make you very protective potentially of the family that you come from. It can make you very protective of, and it can make you very protective and maybe selfish when it comes to your wealth, because you could want to nurture and shelter and protect your wealth. So you might be a bit stingy potentially. And with Mars' fourth aspect, you might have a natural aggressive way of speaking, an aggressive way of communication, an assertive communication. And there could be potentially, depending on other things, speech impediments, a flaw in your speech. Because Mars, like I said, it pierces, it does damage to the house and sign that it sits in or planet that it comes into conjunction with. Of course, there are exceptions, but I'm trying to keep this very simplistic without giving all the nitty-gritty details. But essentially, with the fourth aspect, Mars is going to want to protect and nurture and look after and secure the things of that house. Short and simple. So if Mars was given its fourth aspect to the seventh house, or if Mars' fourth aspect ended up looking at the seventh lord, then we could see that you will probably be very protective over the spouse. Probably very protective and nurturing over the spouse. Want to protect her and nurture her. Mars' fourth aspect on a career, on the 10th house. Mars' fourth aspect on the 10th house. You could probably want to secure and make sure that your work, your job is secure, is locked in through maybe Martian means and methods. You be very protective. Like, no, I'm not losing this job. I'm not losing this position. I'm not going anywhere. I've fought hard for this. I'm going to make sure that I keep it. So now let's talk about Mars' final aspect, which is the 8th aspect. The 8th aspect is going to have the natural significations of the 8th house, which is death, transition, psychological transformation, surgeries, and, uncovering secrets. Uncovering stuff, digging up stuff. To dig something up, you gotta lift earth. You gotta remove something to dig something up. To do surgery, you gotta cut and pierce something to fix something. So, the 8th aspect of Mars is naturally the most damaging aspect of Mars. But it can be good. The 8th aspect can do damage, and it can also bring positive things depending on certain conditions. So with Mars' 8th aspect, maybe from a negative potential, from a negative perspective, Mars' 8th aspect, depending on what house it looks at, depending on what planet it looks at, depending on the sign of Mars and all that stuff, Mars from a negative perspective, it could cause a lot of turbulence in that house and with that planet. Or it could make you really want to it can really make you want to maybe exert a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears towards that area of your life. Like, for example, the 8th aspect is going to have the natural significance of the 8th house, which is death and piercing of things. So you can almost say that with Mars' 8th aspect, that's an area of your life that you're willing to die for. You're willing to bleed for. You're willing to, shed blood, sweat, and tears towards whatever that 8th aspect is. You'll kill for that thing. You could kill for whatever it is, or you can maybe kill that thing. You could kill the thing that it's looking at. So, from a negative perspective, with Mars' 8th aspect on the 10th house, you could potentially be someone who will experience a lot of fights or conflicts in the career, or a lot of transitions and endings within your career. With Mars' 8th aspect, you might be someone who get into physical fights and altercations with people within the career. And then on another flip side, with Mars' 8th aspect, you might, maybe, I don't know, because the 8th house is transitions and sudden losses and sudden gains, depending on your chart and all that stuff. You might be someone who might lose a career, lose a job, but then you might get another better job, potentially. Who knows? But with Mars' 8th aspect, that can be a turbulent area of your life. Now, if Mars is aspecting a Dashunta house, 6th, 8th, and 12th, it's not going to really do bad. You know why? Because the malefic negative planets do well in 6th, 8th, and 12th. Sun, Mars, Saturn, and Rahu and Ketu, they're naturally considered malefic. Or Sun, at least, is considered to be like, you know, mildly malefic. But the malefic planets, they do well within the Shunta houses, the houses that cause potential negative side effects and stuff. They do well. It's fighting fire with fire. It's like putting a rat in a sewer. A rat does well in a sewer. Now, if you put a benefic planet like Venus, Moon, and Mercury to some extent, but Mercury is pretty adaptable. But let's just, for the sake of example, if you put maybe like Jupiter and Venus in 6th, 8th, and 12th, they'll feel a bit uncomfortable. They'll feel a bit maybe damaged to some extent. It's like putting a chihuahua, a pretty white chihuahua, in the sewer. It's getting all dirty. It's got to deal with goddamn rats and alligators. I'm just being funny. I don't really believe alligators fucking exist in sewers and stuff, but you get what I'm saying. A sewer, a rat does better in a sewer than a little cute little puppy or chihuahua. But those are the aspects of Mars. The 4th aspect, you want to nurture and protect and secure. The 8th aspect, you're willing to kill or fight for that aspect, or through fighting and weapons, you're willing to protect that 8th aspect. But like I said, if Mars aspected like the 6th house with its 8th aspect, then it would show that it shows that you will conquer the 6th house through 8th house things. Because you're fighting fire with fire. The 6th house is debts, day-to-day routines, and bills, and diseases. So it shows us that you will instead use the 8th house energy, the 8th aspect of killing, to overcome diseases. You'll overcome and kill and crush the diseases. You'll overcome and kill and knock out your bills and knock out your debts. You might become a workaholic and pay off your bills. And if Mars is maybe given its 8th aspect on the 12th house, you see, it was easier for me to do Mars 8th aspect on 6th versus 12th or 8th. But with Mars 8th aspect going upon the 12th house, of course, it's just a general analysis. It would show us that potentially that when you go do 12th house things, you would experience a lot of 8th house elements. Meaning, if you probably take a trip somewhere new, somewhere foreign, somewhere far, depending on what house Mars is ruling and all that good stuff, you might experience injuries or tragedies or sudden things happening to you, whether it's good or bad, while you are in a new environment, a new country, traveling somewhere. But that should be good enough. That should be a good enough example for y'all to comprehend and understand what Mars does with its 8th aspect in general, what does Mars does with its 4th aspect in general, and what is Mars doing with its 7th aspect. It's going to bring the influence of the house that it sits in to the date, to the house that it's directly looking at. That's what Mars is going to do. And then you just keep that in mind, and you layer that on top of what sign Mars is in. You layer that on top of what nutcrature Mars is in. You layer that on top of what other 2 houses Mars is ruling. Because you see, with Mars's 4th and 8th aspect, it's not going to bring the influence of the house that it's sitting in to those other two aspects. Unless Mars is ruling the house that it sits in, it's not going to bring the influence of the house that it's in. Like, for example, let's say that you have Mars in Aries in the 8th house. And, you know, Mars is in Aries in the 8th house, and it rules the 3rd house of Scorpio. So with Mars' 7th aspect, it's going to bring the influence of the 8th house to the 2nd. And it's going to bring the influence of the 3rd house to the 2nd house. And with Mars' 8th aspect and 4th aspect, it's going to bring the energy and influence of the 3rd, and it's going to bring the influence of the 8th house, the house that it's sitting in, because it rules that house. But if Mars is sitting in a sign that it doesn't rule, that isn't Scorpio or Aries, if Mars is sitting in any other sign except those, then it's not going to bring the influence of the house that it sits in with its 4th or 8th aspect. And I'm going to just end this video right here. I hope that I painted this picture clear enough for you to understand. This might be a little bit too much potentially for someone who is just probably beginning astrology, but if you're someone who has a decent amount of information or knowledge on astrology, then this wasn't too hard to follow. So thank you for watching. See you when I make my next video.